Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. Welcome to our event this morning on this beautiful sunny day. We are launching today our Memos to the New European Leadership, which is the book that you all have now on your lap. This is basically a book that we wrote addressed to the incoming three presidents, so the president of the European Commission, the European Council, and the European Parliament, as well as to 11 individual commissioners. 5 years ago, we started our memos with the following sentence. So when we published when the last commission 5 years took office, we published a similar volume, and we started with the following sentence. I quote, "There's now a distinct possibility that this crisis will be remembered as the occasion when Europe irretrievably lost ground, both economically and politically." 5 years later, so today, it is fair to say that this is a possibility that has probably become a reality. Unemployment has reached record levels and growth has disappointed. Meanwhile, the world outside the EU has continued to change rapidly. And I guess when we wrote this 2 months ago, André, we wouldn't have expected how rapidly it has changed, actually, in particular in our neighborhood. Meanwhile, and of course the emerging markets in particular have increased their weight substantially in the global economy, but also in global decision making. So it is against this background that we wrote those memos, and the principal idea of those memos was quite simple. The idea was that every scholar makes a short assessment of the state of affairs in his field of expertise, his or her field of expertise, and then gives the main challenges and highlights the 3 to 5 main recommendations that he or she would like to address to the incoming commissioner. Scholars therefore followed a common approach in the sense of having always the same forward. However, they do not have a common view. In fact, the scholar's assessment counts, and there is no institutional point of view. The author, him or herself, addresses his analysis directly to the commissioner, and of course also to the broader public, meaning also to all of you that are present today. The 12 memos are released today, but of course the memo to the 3 presidents was already published on July 3, after Jean-Claude Juncker had been nominated by the European Council and before the European Parliament had elected him as president-elect of the European Commission. And in this first memo that was jointly written by André Sapir and myself, we start again from the discussion of the global transformation. And just to give you one figure here, I think it's very important to note that emerging and developing countries by now have reached 50% of world GDP. So that's a very significant increase compared to 5 years or 10 years ago. And their debt to GDP ratios has actually fallen to 40%. While for the developed economies, the debt to GDP ratio is at 110% now. So there's really quite a shift in the economic fundamentals that we are seeing here. So we identified already when we published this in July 3, we said, look, I mean, one of the key priorities is economic growth. And a good growth strategy has to basically consist of both supply-side measures and demand-side measures. And so in a sense, prior to Mario Draghi's important speech in Jackson Hole, we argued that really the strategy, the economic strategy, the new economic strategy should have the supply-side element and this demand-side element, and that you need both elements, not only from a political point of view, but also from an economic point of view, to get growth going in Europe again, and to get employment really up to levels where we would like to have them. Now, without much further ado, I would like to thank André Sapir, who has actually edited this volume, and has done a terrific job in really interacting with all the scholars, giving comments, making suggestions, and who really has been wonderful in putting this memo together. And I would like to give you the floor, André, to present the first President's Memo in more detail.
Thank you very much, Guntram, for the kind words. And this was clearly very much a collaborative effort, and I think that's really what matters. We have great scholars who have contributed really their knowledge and their deep thinking into putting forward their analysis and their recommendations. Now, indeed, let me just sort of go over a few points very briefly about what you and I, Guntram, what is it that we recommended for course of action to the three presidents. And I think it was indeed very important that this time around, contrary to what we did 5 years ago, where we had only made recommendations to the President of the Commission, we felt that this time around it's fundamental that one makes a recommendation to the President of the Commission, to the President of the Council, and the President of the Parliament. And I think that is also showing what is happening in change, and the reality, the institutional reality, but also where the levers are. The levers are not just in one place at the top of the European leadership, but they are in several places. Now, the recommendation, I'd say we made really 4 main recommendations to those three presidents. The first one is the one that you indicated, indeed, sort of the growth strategy, and the importance that this growth strategy be, in a sense, a balanced or two-handed strategy of supply and demand. We very much feel that there's been a lot of, in a sense, waste of time and waste of energy between the two rival camps, ideological camps in Europe, one arguing that it's all supply, problem is all structural, and the other one arguing it's all demand. And I think we very much felt that it's not one or the other, it's the two sides. And in that sense, indeed, I think we felt very much, in a sense, vindicated by the speech of Mario Draghi that puts this forward, even though there are no interpretation of whether he meant really one or the other. But I think really it does mean both. It's one and the other. Now, then there's the issue, which I think we put forward as well, that when you're talking supply and demand, are we talking action at the national level, action at the European level? And again, it's not one or the other. It's both. If you think supply side, sure, there are lots of reforms that need to be done in a number of countries. Italy and France come to mind. But it's not like there are no levers at the European level to do certain things on the structural side, and that's the single market. For God's sake, single market. 20 years after the single market was supposed to have been implemented, it's time to move forward. On the demand side, equally. Obviously, there's some space in some countries, and we know which countries have some space to do certain things and to act, but there are also demand policies that can be implemented at the European level. So I think all this discussion around investment is not a demand or supply. It has both sides, and I think this growth strategy, putting the emphasis on demand and supply, is the first issue. The second issue that we put forward, the second recommendation, is about the organization of the Commission. Obviously, it's not easy to manage a Commission with 28 commissioners. That's not what you would want to do. No? If you had the choice, you would say, you need 15 commissioners. And then you have a clear roadmap of what needs to be done, and you implement with this tight team. Okay? The Commission has 28 commissioners. You need to manage that. But you need to manage that in a way that indeed is not just a question of allocation of portfolios. It's a question of, again, implementing what are the key questions. So we make a whole series of recommendations. One, just to pick one among the recommendations that we make, we say it would be very important to have a vice president for growth. That would also give, it's a question of presenting, what are your priorities? And a vice president for growth probably would not have a portfolio, would not have instruments, but would coordinate, would make sure. And this has always been a discussion in the Commission, how to coordinate, precisely because you have 28 commissioners, many of them with instruments, strong instruments. But how do you manage to make them work in the same direction so that indeed we have a growth policy? Third issue is the neighborhood policy. Neighborhood policy, we believe very much, is number one in shambles, in a sense, and number two, a key priority. You know, during the economic crisis, we saw Europe as being the center of the economic difficulty in the world. After we had the start of the financial crisis in the US, then the center of gravity moved to the Europe and the Euro area crisis. But when you look now at the political issues in the world, where are they? They're all in Europe's neighborhood. Whether it's on the eastern neighborhood or whether it's on the southern neighborhood, including obviously the Middle East. And you know, how have we really reacted to this? I wished we were not simply reacting, we were proactive. I think it has been rather dismal. So we feel very much that this is also a huge priority for Europe, not just for the Commission, for Europe to put in place a strong neighborhood policy. And that requires a number of rethinking. And that will address issues like Turkey and other matters that are difficult to address, but they need to be addressed. One cannot sort of keep on going in this manner. The fourth and last recommendation that I want to put forward is about the architecture of Europe. I think we feel very much that the leadership, although it needs to address a number of pressing issues, the growth, the organization of the Commission, the neighborhood, those are pressing issues. They are today's issue. Those issues, they also cannot be resolved in a long-lasting manner without having a serious rethinking about the future of Europe, about the architecture of Europe. So what we really feel that the leadership should not just sort of concentrate on the short term. This is very much a task that they need to do, but they need also to put forward thinking, and we would very much hope that by June of next year, there would be a declaration on the future of Europe. They would be appointed a high-level committee precisely to put forward ideas, so that by the end of this commission,
for the last 3 years at least has been the most important issue here in Brussels. So I encourage everyone not only to read it, but keep it on your bookshelf because it's likely to become useful for the future. Now, as Guntram pointed out, I am a journalist. I am not an economist, which always makes me a little bit intimidated sitting on the same stage as Guntram and Andre. But I'd like to bring to the discussion is perhaps an area I am more expert in as a journalist, which is political economy. Because, and also I think my role as a journalist sometimes is to play the contrarian voice, or at least be a little bit provocative. So I'm going to disagree slightly with some of the conclusions, perhaps not the conclusions themselves, but maybe pay the cynic and argue that we, although the recipes presented in many of these memos, particularly the opening memo, are all worthy, the chances of them actually happening are rather slim. And I argue this because I'm quite concerned about the expectations game. What we saw, I think, in the last European elections, particularly in the two countries that keep coming up, France and Italy, is a blaming of Europe for the lack of growth in Europe. And by that, obviously, I mean Brussels. But if you look at what ails Europe, Brussels does not ail Europe. The problem of growth in Italy and France is structural labor market problems in Italy and France that are down to the national governments. These are not something that can be solved on a European level. Now, it actually spelled out in your opening memo. I turn to page 8, and it makes it quite clear, I think, and I would agree with this point, is discussion about, you mentioned not only France and Italy, but you mentioned Germany on the demand side, and you say you have relatively little leverage over these countries. For France and Italy, the European Commission has an arsenal of fiscal rules at its disposal, but the size of the countries gives them bargaining power that everyone knows it. I think that puts it right very clearly. I think what we've seen, particularly with Front National, but even with Renzi, who, let's be honest, is even 3 months after or 2 months after a quite stunning victory in the European elections, has already seen his popularity falling, and populist groups like Beppe Grillo rising again, is a campaign that everything is the fault of Brussels. If it weren't for the austerity-led policies of Brussels, everything would be fine. And what we know is that's not true. So the appetite for reform in the member states is minimal, and it is not something that Brussels can solve, I would argue. And so that's why I worry slightly about the expectations game here, is that there are very few tools, and again, I hate to disagree with Andre, who knows this institution better than I do, but I would argue there are actually very few tools Europe has to stimulate growth. What tools does Europe actually have? The first one is the new fiscal rules. The six-pack, the two-pack, all these kinds of things. I know I'm not supposed to do this, but I skipped ahead slightly to Zolt's piece on the advice to Moscovici, to the new economics commissioner. And he has, on page 27, once again, pointed out the conundrum in this. The commissioner has 3 choices. He can, 1, enforce these rules very stringently, as they're written, which for France and Italy could cause even further political and social disruption, because already they're angry at the austerity-led policies in Brussels. Can you imagine what happens if Pierre Moscovici orders fines in France and Italy for missing their targets? What is the political reaction of that going to be? The other option, as Zolt points out, is to renegotiate this six-pack and the fiscal rules, which Renzi seems to be arguing. Good God, if I have to cover another renegotiation of the Stability and Growth Pact, I'm going to shoot myself. But the point is that this will undermine any credibility that these rules have. It was just 2 years ago, 3 years ago that we renegotiated them. Are they really going to go through yet another renegotiation when these rules become difficult? Option 3, which is what they've done so far, is muddling through and extend and pretend that because the technical flexibility within the rules, that actually France and Italy don't need to do it now, maybe you do it another 2 and 3 years. I think we've reached the limit of that faking. So on the fiscal rules, which is the tool that was created specifically to address this problem, we have no good options. And I would argue that this tool is therefore rather limited. Andre, you pointed out very rightly, the other tool at the disposal is a single market. But again, as you also pointed out, it's been 20 years. If structural reforms are difficult, if not impossible, on the national level, I see no way it is going to be possible on a European level. So I think, once again, we in these rooms who study these things know this is obviously the right thing to do. Again, when you look at political economy, I think they're impossible. Last year, you mentioned in the paper the role of the budget and the role the EU budget could play, particularly in solving the problems of the single market, interconnectedness, which again, we look at energy in particular, but there are other areas, in terms of infrastructure, rail, roads. Almost every single European infrastructure was based in the nation state. Clearly, it would help the economic growth of Europe if it was interconnected and functioned more as a common market. But if we look at the last MFF negotiation, what was stripped out of the budget at the very last minute? This. Because of national prerogatives, where they wanted their cap money, they wanted their structural funds. They just don't act on a European level when it comes to investment. So I, unfortunately, would say that although there are tools there, they are unlikely to be used. Lastly, the one other thing that I want to highlight, it's on page 11, and Guntram, I fear you're going to be kicked out of the Germans for advocating this, but it does actually advocate stimulus spending, 100 billion euros a year, 2015 and 2016. But again, we run into this problem. Those that can don't, Germany, and those who want to can't, Italy and France. I'm not sure where that 100 billion euros comes from, because unless Germany has a brain transplant, they are not going to support stimulus spending, and that is the only sizable European economy that has the space to do it. So I would argue that while all the goals that we pointed out here are the right ones. I just don't think the political economy is going to allow us to do any of these things.
Okay. Andre, you want to react?
No, I mean, you know, someone like me who wrote a piece on the EU budget 10 years ago cannot disagree lightly with what you just said. And I always say that, you know, muddling through is the central scenario. There's no doubt about this. I think what is the important element, so, you know, if we're coming back in 5 years from now, and, you know, we observe the situation, and you were then to tell me, you see, I told you so, I would say, yes, I also knew that muddling through is the central scenario. However, so, you know, this I take for granted in a sense. I think the important element here is, one sense, what Guntram said, how the world is changing. What I always try to do when I get an opportunity to meet ministers, and especially when I meet many of them together, I keep telling them, while you guys are wasting your time in muddling through, the world is changing at a rapid pace. And I think this is what the EU leadership needs to bang on the table all the time. So it's cajoling, it's convincing, it's telling them we need to move. And yes, the option is not to do anything, continuing like this, but there is a high cost. And I think this is what the leadership needs to remind. It's not so much that the leadership has all the levers that it can put into place, but it really needs to remind them, what does it mean to continue muddling through? What does it mean in terms of domestic issues, in terms of unemployment, in terms of low growth, and in terms of incapability of dealing with our neighborhood and with the global issues? That's all.
Okay, excellent. So our time is already up. So let me invite the next panel here on the stage, and I hope that in the next panel we will have a little bit of time to discuss some further issues. Certainly the fiscal rules and stability and growth pact will figure also later, so we will have time to come back to that. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks, Guntram. Thanks a lot. I think we had a good start. So let me invite the panelists. All the panelists, please. So we have divided the rest of the morning into 3 blocks of memos, and the first block of memo that we are going to discuss now is the block on growth. Which way for growth? And we have put there 4 of the memos. There's one memo addressed to the Commission on Competition Policy, one on the Commission of Single Market, one on the Commissioner for Digital Agenda, and one to the Commissioner for Research Policy. And we have 2 fellows who have been central to those 4 memos. Renilde Veugelers on my right, and Mario Mariniello on my left. And we are lucky to have also 2 discussants to those memo, Wolfgang Kopf, who is the Senior Vice President at Deutsche Telekom, and Antoine Aubert, who is the head of the Brussels policy team at Google. So what we will do, I've asked the two fellows to briefly put forward what are the main points of their memos. We'll do it one memo after the other, and they will have 5 minutes each, as we did in the previous session. And then I will turn to the discussants, and they will select in those memos what they feel is relevant that they want to address, and then we'll have hopefully a little bit of time for the discussion with the floor. So Mario, let me first turn to you. The competition policy memo, what are the recommendations that you address to the commissioner?
Okay, thanks a lot, Andre. Well, I think it's fair to say that in these years competition policy has been under a lot of pressure. And I think this is kind of natural, because in times of crisis, you tend to question whether what you're doing is right. But I have the feeling that the jacket of antitrust has been, so to speak, pulled in opposite direction. From one hand, there has been a tendency of saying, look, the European business is under deep stress. There's a lot of competition out there, particularly from emerging economies. So rules should be relaxed. We should allow more consolidation. We should be more lenient with sanctioning cartels, for example. We should allow member states to subsidize companies and pursue their own industrial policy plans. From the other hand, instead, antitrust has been often asked to take a more proactive role. For example, sometimes we hear asking antitrust to mandate certain prices or to act against certain companies just because they enjoy a certain degree of market power. So the new commissioner will step in this kind of schizophrenic, I would say, context. And here comes my first suggestion, which I think is going to be the most important challenge and priority for the new commissioner. And this is to do her best to preserve the independence of antitrust action from any attempt of external conditioning. I think it is really as simple as that. By standing her ground, by doing her job properly to preserve fair competition within a single market, that the next commissioner will be able to contribute the most to the European economy. Because I think it's already embedded in the nature of antitrust to take into account the health of the business environment. Because, of course, if you don't have a healthy business environment, in the long term, also those that are the direct beneficiaries of antitrust action, consumers, would lose out. So, and indeed, economics has shown that fair competition prompts a reallocation of resources to the best and more efficient companies. So you really, if you enforce properly competition rules, you can reward those behaviors that are needed to stimulate the economy. So it's no time for being soft. It's no time for being tough just for the sake of it. It's just the time for enforcing rules for what they are in a scientific way. Now, the second challenge that I'm going to mention is to try to have a more strategic approach. And I think this is a little bit an issue which is general with the Commission, so we will mention it also with the single market and the digital agenda. But I think in the case of antitrust, the point is that what we observe today is that most of the cases are initiated because of complaints or because of whistleblowers. But then what happens is that antitrust comes when the damage has already been done. So, and especially in those markets where timing is crucial, say digital, this can be really an issue. Okay, so you want to implement a clever monitoring strategy in order to anticipate the issues before they blow up. And finally, the last challenge that I'm going to mention, I think the next Commission will have to pay a lot of attention to international coordination of antitrust matters. Clearly, the existence of global markets and global competitors requires consistent global antitrust approaches. And I think we have a little bit of a privileged role here because everybody is looking at what the Commission is doing. Therefore, I think the next Commission will have to try to prompt as much as possible convergence. And this applies externally because we know that the other antitrust authorities around the world do not apply the same standards that we do. But also internally, because we know that there is a degree of inconsistency within the single market, because the antitrust authorities of different member states apply different standards, for example, in merger control. So it's very important that the Commissioner will put an effort in prompting convergence also within the single market.
Great, thanks Mario. So let me now turn to you, Renilde, about the single market. I mean, we just heard in the previous discussion, how difficult clearly the full implementation of the single market has been and probably will continue to be. So, what recommendations are you making to the Commissioner in charge of single market?
Yes, So indeed, the single market's biggest challenge is really that, as already stated by Mario Monti in 2012 when he did his report, is that single market today is less popular than ever, while it's more needed than ever in Europe. And I think that's even more true these days than it was in 2012 here. Nevertheless, I have a bit more of an optimistic perspective than Peter Spiegel, so I think we can make progress on this. And our major recommendation to deal with that particular challenge of integration fatigue here is really to go for a very consistent monitoring of the single market and monitoring of the effects of the single market here. So we know that in many important areas, single market is still incomplete. And that it needs to be progressed, but that these areas where it needs to be progressed are really much more difficult areas than before. So these are the high-hanging fruits of single market, and that's why it will be very, very challenging to deal with these new areas here. But that's why it's even more important to go for this monitoring of the single market and an effects-based approach here. What is the importance of, so what would be such a consistent monitoring of markets actually bring to the policy floor here? So first of all, it's much more than just tracing the single market scoreboard, tracking the transposition of single market legislation. It's really picking pivotal markets, and especially those that matter most for growth, where particularly those that have important externalities on other markets. So these include digital business services markets, but also energy markets, transport markets. So these will definitely be very important to consistently monitor. And it's not just monitor on the transposition of single market legislation, but much more importantly is to monitor the effects of the single market. How are the cross-border flows in trade, in labor going on in these markets here? And what are the effects of this? Do we see still price differences, cost differences, productivity differences here? And it's that kind of evidence on effects and on flows, mapping all that will really be able to identify what the critical problems are in these markets, critical problems that are related to and can be addressed with single market instruments here. So that would actually mean the advantage of this kind of consistent and broad-based monitoring of the single market would, first of all, allow you to prioritize better your actions. So I'm talking as if he would be in the room here, but obviously he is not. So that will allow you to prioritize your actions on those markets that matter most for growth and to avoid wasting time on other areas here. So prioritizing much more effectively. Secondly, it will allow you to intervene much more effectively with instruments that matter much more for growth effects here. So second very important advantage of monitoring strategy here. And thirdly, it will also allow you to convince more the opponents of more integration here by being able to provide more data on what the net benefits would be of single market intervention here. Now, this will not always lead to more and new legislation here. It could also identify areas where actually legislation would have to be reduced or would have to be changed here. So it's not always more, it's definitely has to be better here. And then finally, one other recommendation which there are plenty of other recommendations, but one other which I think is also very important to make it much more simpler. Simplification here is our idea of launching a single market passport, administrative passport, that's basically mutual recognition of administrative procedures. Once this is cleared in one country, you can, with this passport, also address other markets as well.
Thanks, Renil. So, Mario, let me turn again to you on the memo that you addressed to the commissioner in charge of the digital agenda. I mean, very much related to the single market in a sense, and one that receives a lot of discussion, you know, in the newspapers all the time. So, what are your main recommendations here?
Well, I think there is no doubt that digital is very important. Actually, that is extremely important to have a single digital market. But at the end of the day, I think the problem is that there is little clarity on what that means in practice. And of course, to be able to reach an objective, you first need to have it clear what your objective is. Now, the digital challenge is a particularly complex one. And it's complex because we are talking about very highly dynamic markets that yet heavily depend on infrastructure. And so that means that there is an important static element that you need to take into account. We are talking about goods, services that can travel the world in a blink of an eye. We are talking about unpredictable supply and demand. And yet you need to have enough certainty to guarantee investment, because if you don't have infrastructure, of course you don't have anything. So there is this fundamental tension between dynamism and structural needs. We are also talking about, fluid markets that are very difficult to pin down geographically. Therefore, these exacerbate the issue with the multiple regulatory framework, right? So, and that's why this is believed to be one of the main problems hampering the development of the digital market in Europe, the lack of a homogeneous regulatory framework. And finally, we are talking about a business structure which is particularly complex from an economic point of view. You have huge network externalities, high fixed costs, zero marginal cost, multi-sided digital platforms in which you have lots of players that are very different from each other. So users, content providers, distributor, infrastructure owners, virtual operators, etc., that they all exert some sort of externalities on each other. So it becomes very complex to think about an optimal market structure which maximizes welfare. So in this context, the first and most important challenge for the next commissioner will be to define an object of action and shape a coherent and predictable long-term strategy to pursue it. So once you have done that, you can think about the optimal tools to reach it, but it's very important that the new commissioner will commit to such a strategy and to pursue it coherently in the future, because this will contribute a lot to give certainty to operators in the sector. And of course, we know that certainty is a key driver for investment. Now, the second challenge is really about the content of this object, and I think this should be the long-term effects on users. I think to measure the success of the Commission, we should really check how much close we get to the utopia of a universal access to fast communication at the lowest possible price for consumers and business customers everywhere in Europe. But the long-term effects are never obvious. So therefore, you really need a case-by-case analysis. So just to give you an example, like roaming fees. We know, of course, it's a problem if you travel around Europe and you're overcharged when you're making cross-border calls. But if you force the same price for domestic and cross-border calls, you might end up with higher domestic prices. Okay, you might, you also may not. But the point is that price discrimination does never have obvious effects. So this leaves open the question, what is the best way to achieve lower roaming fees? Is it through caps or is it through more competition in the roaming market? Same applies to net neutrality. Welfare effects are not obvious. So you might, if you allow price discrimination, you might have a more efficient allocation of web traffic. But on the other hand, you expose yourself to risk of abuse. So in general, you need a case-by-case approach in which you scientifically see what is going to be the effect on final users. And my third and last suggestion is I think that the Commission should really try to give more impulse to stimulate the demand of digital services. And this applies to three levels. The first one is on public service. I think they should promote even more vigorously a shift of public service to digital. Then on business level, you should try to, promote the adoption of digital process in production process, targeting particularly small and medium enterprises that find it more difficult to sustain the initial fixed cost to switch to digital. And finally, for consumers, to try to stimulate the demand, probably promoting subsidies or tax breaks within member states.
Thanks, Mario. So to conclude this round of presentations of the memos, let me turn once again to you, Renilde, and ask you the same question I asked you before, now pertaining to the research commissioner. What are the main recommendations that you're making to to the new commissioner, whoever will be appointed in the coming days as the commissioner in charge of research.
Yeah, so when we talk about innovation policy at the EU level, this is really a very challenging agenda, and that's very well known. These challenges are very structural and long-standing, and they mostly relate not so much to the challenges to create new ideas, but more to turn these ideas into innovation-based growth and commercialization here. Europe still really doesn't have a single market for innovators. That's very well known. But that really poses a big challenge on the Commissioner for Research, because actually, particularly with respect to innovation and bringing innovations to market, he has actually very limited powers here. Other things like the single market, like competition policy, are much more important instruments than the Commissioner has. And this is why actually we propose a drastic change here, in the sense that we no longer want innovation to be just within the portfolio of the DG Research here. Innovation is so important and requires so many other instruments and other DGs here that should really reside with the Vice President for Growth here, rather than within the DG Research Commissioner. This is not to say that we don't think innovation is important here, or that the Research Commissioner shouldn't care about innovation. It's just that coordinating with other instruments that reside in other DGs has been traditionally very difficult for any commissioner here, and it really sits much better at a higher level where it can be better coordinated. And that would also free up the attention of DG Research and the commissioner to really focus on the research agenda and the instruments that he really controls, to make sure that that research fits better into the innovation-based growth agenda. And that means concentrating better on the two major instruments, which are the funding, the Horizon 2020, and also the European Research Area, the ERA project here. That ERA project is about having an internal market for research, but also a European market for research, that it's much more open in the global context here. So if we take a look then at these two instruments and how they can be better tuned to that innovation-based policy agenda, first to turn to the budget, the Horizon 2020. So we have been in the past been very lucky to have an increase in that Horizon 2020 budget here. There has been a lot of discussion on trying to simplify. I'm not going to go further into that. But what I think would still be a substantial improvement in that budget instrument here is to use the model of that the ERC has for the excellent science pillar, and that has proven to be successful, a model where there is an independent scientific council that is in charge of selecting panels and selecting proposals here, to use that model also for other parts of the framework program here, particularly also the ones for industry leadership here, to have also similarly, you decide as a commissioner on objectives, on strategies and allocation to different areas here, but then within each different area you have an independent technology council that is in charge of selecting panels, selecting procedures and monitoring of the selection of proposals here, and then you have an independent agency that will administer these procedures here. That would simplify the role of the commissioner to just make sure that the stated objectives will be met by that independent technology council here. Another important part of the budget, which unfortunately doesn't belong to the DG Research Commissioner, is the Marie Curie fellowships here. They sit with EAC, and that's really unfortunate because that's really, I think, the major instrument that the Commissioner can use for the other important instrument, which is the European Research Area here. And if we really want to create a single market for research, the flow of people is very important here, and these fellowships are a very important mechanism here. So we would actually advocate to bring that instrument also within the research portfolio, so that you have a very important instrument for reaching the ERA. And this is not just only the Marie Curie fellowships for mobility within Europe here, but I think what's also very important is to focus more on making the European research area much more open internationally here, and open to those areas that and countries that really matter for science and innovation here. So that clearly means much more emphasis on other countries like the US and emerging Asia here, rather than more ad hoc considerations for selecting partners to collaborate internationally here. So using also the Marie Curie fellowships for opening up to these critical markets is another suggestion beyond many others that are in the note here, but I'm out of time.
Okay, great. So we had very briefly a presentation of 4 memos that contain many, many more discussion that what we had the time to, or that you had the time to present. Let me turn to you, Wolfgang. I mean, since you have a choice to address either sort of the area that you may be more directly involved in, or sort of take a broader view about what those memos are putting forward, sort of as a growth strategy. I mean, do they add up to a growth strategy? Are there things missing here? What is your vision about those memos, or particular memo on digital? What is your take?
Well, thank you. Before I comment on the single memos, let me first congratulate Guntram and you and the team for having put together such a book. I like this kind of book and this comprehensive approach very much. And as a Bruegel board member, I'm very proud. Because such books are really helpful, I think. I first got to know them in the US, like this Carter book for Congress, and they're always, you should look at them 2 years later and might come back to such recommendations. So this approach is very good. Same applies, in my view, for the focus of the book. It's growth and it's the organization of the Commission, I think, and neighborhood policy, which is now extremely important, of course, due to the events of the last 2 months. But let me focus on growth and organization on the Commission. I think that's something when we try to look at the issues which can be solved at Brussels, those are the key issues. And I'm not too pessimistic that this mudding through will continue. I'm more optimistic like Rainer Hilde, because my sense from maybe only reading press, but sometimes also talking to policymakers, is that there's a sense of urgency. And the Bruegel recommendation really put forward some very good proposals with regard to this sense of urgency. Commenting, I'd like to comment on maybe 3 of the, but that's rather ambitious given the limited time. On competition policy, that's, I have to say, one of the memos I disagree. So I start with that. Maybe the reason is why I'm disagreeing. I'm in competition law and policy now on different sides for more than 25 years. And what I'm observing in the past 4 years is something I haven't seen before. And this is a really growing uneasiness with the application of competition rules in Europe. And this has to do with enforcement levels, so that the recommendation keep it up and keep enforcing is something I would put into question. What we've seen in the past 4 years is something I would call a co-regulation by DG Competition. There's heavy regulation in many industries, network industries, pharmaceuticals. What we've seen is in many of these sectors that DG Competition has picked up cases which were already decided by regulators, which are applying special competition law, and reopening such cases. I very much doubt that this is an approach we are fostering growth. It's just a heavy bureaucratic burden, and it's completely the wrong approach if you want companies to invest in Europe. When it comes to policy, I also question the approach to focus even more on consumer welfare. If you want to rely on growth, there's a total welfare approach you have to look at. I'm not saying abolish consumer welfare. It's the right standard in principle, but if you're not looking at, in market decision, at supply factors coming from outside Europe, we are facing huge competition outside Europe, and it's coming in. If you're not looking at the efficiencies, the dynamic efficiencies, investment banker call those synergies in merger cases, and you turn that against merging parties, you're overseeing not the entire thing. So far, I don't think we need more monitoring, because monitoring means ex ante. And that means a competition authority looks at markets continuously, and that's not the task of competition law. Let me turn to what you said on the single market. I think there I fully agree. I really agree with prioritize your actions and picking the right markets. And the digital market is one of the most important markets. Why is it? So, investment in digital markets, ICT as we call it in our sector, so information, communication and telecoms, counts for more than 30% of the productive growth in Europe. In the US, it's already more than 50%. So any investment in such a market has a huge effect on growth. And in that regard, I think the investment in networks is one of the most important investments. And there I really agree that we should focus and we should have a digital agenda. One thing is missing in my view. If you want to foster also research and innovation, the focus should also go on startups. And if you look at 2013, 40 billion seed money in the world, more than 33 billion went to the US. And it was only about 3 billion going to Europe, and that was less than the amount which went to Israel. And there we are having a problem. So I think looking at how to develop startup communities, not the single startup, I mean, that's for them, that's entrepreneurship, is something we should also focus on. Thank you.
Thank you, Wolfgang. I think that was very, very useful to hear your perspective, positive and negative. I mean, that's very well taken and very much needed in our environment. That's what a think tank is about. That one, reflects on those matters and debates them very, very sharply. Antoine, I turn to you. I don't know whether you want to concentrate on the digital issue or you want to take a broader view. I leave it to you.
Well, obviously,
it's on.
Obviously, I'm working with Google, so I'm going to focus on digital agenda and single market and the combination of the two that was mentioned before. That is the digital market. I would just like to join my predecessor in congratulating you for the quality of the memo. I was lucky enough that I got it a bit in advance, so I had time to actually read it. Obviously everybody's there because of the high quality of the memo you're providing. So I think it's very useful moving into new European institution to have such a memo at end. It has a strange feeling reading it because it's addressed directly to the new EU leadership. So you're feeling very important reading it, and so I personally really enjoy it. As I say, I'm going to mainly focus on the section on digital agenda and the single market and building on the comment that were already made. So these two issues are increasingly merged under the objective of creating a digital single market. And my understanding from a statement from President Juncker is that it's going to be pretty high on the agenda of the next of the next Commission now. I agree with Mario that we often talk about, and quite often talk about the digital single market, but we are not so sure on what it means. I think there's a positive aspect that is we definitely need a more harmonized, less fragmented structure. We also need to make sure that there would be no more fragmentation. We do see under certain and in certain countries new legislation that are leading to a more fragmented market as opposed to a more harmonized market. So one of the reasons why the digital single market is so incredibly important is because in the internet economy, scale is pretty much everything. So an entrepreneur like working in Europe or in the US will ask herself, or she can move from 1 million users to 10 million users and have like a proof model for, or a proof concept for a business. Then she would wonder how she moved to 10 from 300 million users and then own a large market. And then finally, the most ambitious startup or the most ambitious company will look for how they can actually go to the 1 billion user. That is pretty much the holy grail for many internet business. Now, in the US, the regulatory cost for an entrepreneur to go from 1 to 10 to 300 is really the cost of one legal system. And in the EU, EU entrepreneurs are still facing 28 fragmented systems. And so that's why Europe does have a vibrant scene for startup, but many of them have trouble to actually become scale-up and then move from this 110 to this 300 million and really become some global player. I actually believe, and that was a comment that was made already, that they are maybe missing a bit of focus on actually the startup scale-ups and young company in the memo. This is important for European digital economy because they're the companies that are disruptive and innovative. They are the ones that are driving growth and job. And these are the companies that are like technology-intensive company. There's all different kind of data from the OECD showing that young companies are the ones that are driving growth, but they're also the ones that are creating jobs. And 50% of the new jobs that were created globally actually come from 5 years or younger companies. So I think it's very important area for policymakers to look into and to think when they're seeking digital and supporting startup and scale-up company to try and help tackle the problem of youth unemployment. As Google, we're very keen on supporting the startup scene in Europe. We've been creating and developing some startup incubator in different countries, in London, in Berlin, in Paris. We're working on Warsaw. There was a mention of Lex of investment in startup. We're also very keen on obviously investing in startup in Europe, where we have a plan to invest $100 million pretty much in the coming years on startups through Google Venture. So completing the digital single market will be central to create the right environment for this innovative company and startup so that they can grow and reach a global scale. And I guess the digital single market would be a mix in between more harmonization and preventing more fragmentation as well. Just one last comment. I see you're in a rush. You want to make sure that we're on time.
You're fine.
I was very interested by the memo on the digital agenda and the focus on the demand side as opposed to the supply side. And I think if you're looking historically at the successive strategy from the European Commission, obviously from the beginning, so if you think Europe 2005, I-2010, they were really focused on the supply side. So how do we build the network infrastructure we all need? How do we build the content services that we all need to actually feed this network infrastructure? And so the strategy of the Commission and digital agenda and successive strategy has very much been focused on the supply side as opposed to the demand side. And so it's becoming pretty obvious that Europe does not lag behind when it comes to innovation. And I think that's one of the key comments you made when it comes to productivity. Europe lags behind when it comes to adoption of technology and then making the most of the benefit that technology is bringing about. So the point you're making about 30% of productivity growth coming from ICT in Europe against 50% in the US. Obviously, we need to catch up, and we need to make sure that we will drive the demand and drive the use of new technology. So I think that was really spot on. And again, so we really need a digital agenda that is driving use of technology across all type of sector and company. I think this point had become very clear about, well, let's say 18 months ago. There's not a digital economy. There's like an economy that is digital. I think that's the point that Commissioner Kroes and that is very clear. Is like digital is actually powering a brand new economy and is pretty much in each and every sector of the economy. Just one last point, because on one of the comments you're making about a more integrated digital strategy, and I think this is also very important. If we're keeping in mind that digital is everywhere and is so important for the economy, I think having different Directorate General coordinating and better integrating policy would be pretty essential. I will just give one example and practical example. So we've been working and involved with the European Commission and different DG on many initiatives for entrepreneurship online. For there was the Grand Coalition, there was the Startup Manifesto, and so there were all different kind of initiatives going in different directions on how we can actually make sure that the internet will deliver fully for jobs. And this is a typical example where a more integrated approach would actually help having a much more effective result and make the impact of the internet much greater. That was my last remark. Many thanks.
Very good, very good. Thanks to all of you for keeping up the time. That allows us to have a bit of a discussion with the audience. So I will give at the end, obviously, to both Renilde and Mario the occasion to say some words in response to the excellent comments by the two discussants. Let me just sort of open the floor for discussion on this growth memos, and let me just say also make a parenthesis here. We have heard 4 memos: competition, single market, digital agenda, research. Some of you may say that there is a piece maybe missing in the growth discussion, and growth often goes with employment. Where is the labor market and employment dimension? And I think that would be a very fair point, and I think this is, in a sense, a failure on our part. We were unable, for a variety of reasons, we were unable to have a memo addressed to the Commissioner for employment and social affairs. And I mean, it's obviously an important dimension, not only because unemployment is high, but I think growth also need labor market and social policies that work better. So this is not addressed, and as I say, it is rather unfortunate because I think we all believe that it's a very, very important dimension. Again, not only because there is high unemployment, but because it's a key ingredient for sort of reforms in this domain in order to foster growth. But there we are. So I would like to invite comments, remarks, questions on the part of the audience, remarks to the two fellows, also remarks or comments to the commentators. So who would like to make some comments? Yes, please. Do we have a microphone? Yes, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Sietske de Groot from the Federation of Small Businesses in the UK, and I'm looking at digital single market issues. I have a question for Mario. You were giving an example of roaming charges and how harmonization could result in higher prices because you harmonize it across the UK. There is, well, a set of 10, 15 policy issues for the single market to solve. And I think for every one of those policy issues, that might be the case. And I'm particularly thinking of the UK. So how are you going to solve that if you can't harmonize because it would be detrimental to some countries? What are other solutions?
Let's just collect a few more questions. Is there another? Yes, please. There's a microphone coming.
Hi, James Lovegrove from APCO. Just a speedy question about the structure. You mentioned right at the beginning about the organization of the EU and getting that right in order to actually deploy the brilliant ideas you have in the memos. And of course, the speculation is rife, isn't it, about the runners and riders and so forth. A lot of ink has been spilt on that. And I guess the question to the whole panel is sort of the observation, as we understand the latest, is that the Digital Agenda Commissioner, him or herself, doesn't exist. It's been moved into another orbit, and there are a number of other portfolios which fall under that. So some observations on that would be most appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you. Another? Should I take another? Okay, nothing other more. So Mario, let me turn to you and give some comments on both the questions that have been raised and the discussions.
Sure. I mean, look, for the roaming fees, I think this is a very complex, issue. Of course, I'm not against harmonization. Quite the contrary, obviously. What I'm trying to say is that it's never obvious if you implement a certain policy that you will obtain what you're really looking for. So you need to, each time that you are, considering a certain market, say UK, in this case, I mean, like you want to see what is going to be the final effect of your policy, and you have to do it carefully. Now, what I've seen until now is more like, we don't like roaming fees, that we think they are too high, so let's try to reduce them in some way. Now, what I'm trying to say, maybe there are several tools that we have to consider. I could say try to foster more competition in the roaming market. I mean, I think this is one of the things that I would be more leaning towards. But of course, I don't have a solution which is general, because that's my main message. My main message is, go there and check really, which is an exercise that I haven't seen done that much. Really measure it scientifically before doing something. Just don't. So that's my. Now, to reply to Mr. Conf, I could just briefly. I would like to say that, of course, I agree that we shouldn't have a bureaucratic approach. That's, in fact, my main message. We should be scientific.
Talking to what, competition or to digital, or what are you?
I switched to competition because you said to address the sorry.
Just be clear.
Yeah. Okay. So I think we should not be bureaucratic, of course. But you also suggest that
you mean they.
We, I mean, like
you mean they, the commission.
Already, I mean, nominations are not done yet, so I mean, I could still, be a candidate. I'm joking. No, no, I'm saying that if you are suggesting to move away from a consumer welfare standard, because in that way we should end up like considering more efficiencies. Right? But I think there is no really attrition between considering a consumer welfare and considering efficiencies. In fact, with consumer welfare, what we mean is considering efficiencies that then at the end spill over consumers. And I think this is very important because, you don't want to have growth just for the sake of it. You want to deliver the benefits of growth to consumers at the end. So I think we should stick to that approach. That's my my answer to you. And in terms of structure, I'm not sure. Definitely, I think digital should get a prominent role. And the fact that we are thinking about Bruegel, we are thinking about proposing a structure which should empower a vice president to consider particularly the issues related to growth. I think should be seen as something complementary, right? I mean, like you want to have a digital portfolio that is intrinsically linked to the issues of growth, and maybe like with the collaboration between the vice president and the next commissioner for digital agenda, you might have that. But When? Sure. I mean, like that's exactly the point of we are proposing. I'm not Juncker, but of course, I mean, this could be something to be discussed right now. Yeah.
Well, maybe one brief comment to your question. I think it's highly debated also in our industries what's the best approach here, and I can only comment on rumors, and the rumors today are internal market and digitalization are in one portfolio, and I think that would be the right approach, because as I said, the digitalization is one of the key factors also for building the internal market and contributing to growth. And if you're integrating that, in my view, it gets more important. Of course, there's a different view saying if we have a separate commissioner, he can be the sole promoter, but I think it has many merits to integrate that.
Thanks. Renilde?
So 3 issues. So first of all, on this digital and how high it should sit in the agenda, it's clear that digital is very closely interrelated with innovation because it initiates quite a lot of innovation and also growth. So that's why these issues are really so much cross-cutting that if you give it only one DG, here that almost immediately turns off other DGs with their important instruments here, and that's why it's very important that digital should be integrated with innovation and growth at a higher level, higher than individual DGs. On the issue of regulation and competition and how to better coordinate that, so that's indeed, again, an issue of design of the Commission and better coordination, single markets with competition. That plays out particularly important, I think, for new markets, digital markets obviously, but also other markets like in biotech. And it's actually very important that both instruments are really developed in a complementary fashion, how they can actually complement each other rather than have to substitute for each other's failures here. It's not so clear actually that particularly in new markets, regulation is always the best instrument because there is so many uncertainties that you might also get it wrong with regulation and get into path dependencies and lock-ins, and then relying on well-performing competition policy instruments might give you more flexibility here. So particularly in new markets, I think we really have to design both instruments much more in a complementary fashion. And then finally on startups here, first of all, I'd like to make the point that perhaps we should move also a bit away the focus on startups. What's really very important is the growth of startups into world market leadership here, at least the ones which have the best projects here. So rather than focusing too much on startups, I would like to focus on these growing firms here, which we have labeled Jollies in Bruegel here, and then how to deal with their barriers here. Of course, what's very important is what they're missing. It's very often a single market for innovation, and that has partly to do with financing, but if we address financing, that's not just only public resources for financing, but also how to activate risk capital markets more for financing these growth projects here, and I think that's why other memos, which we will be discussing later, will also be very important. But if we particularly talk about public funding and of the use of EU public funding for startups here, I fully agree we should experiment also more with some new instruments focusing on this, supporting this growth for these young innovators here. So that's why we proposed also a BIR type of program in Europe, and also support for emerging clusters. But I think that really requires moving away from now the perspective that all EU funds should always be about large EU networks. Here, I think here we should really focus on individual in projects here that don't necessarily always have to die in large European networks.
Thanks. Antoine, do you want to add something?
I don't know if I should comment on the next structure for the next European Commission. This is a bit over my pay grade. I've seen all different kind of scenario, and yeah, I suspect you've seen the same thing I've seen this morning. I think if you're looking in terms of how different type of regulation were dealt with under the last Commission, you had like cybersecurity, telecom single market, public sector information falling in the digital agenda directorate. On the other side, you had like some very important piece of regulation that were dealt with by internal market that were like potentially having an effect on all internet business. I mean, if you think about the e-commerce directive and the fact that it's pretty much where ISP liability or intermediary liability lies, it's like a key piece of regulation. So if you think about mobile payment and having internal market. So I don't know what the best structure would be. I think a more integrated structure, whether it's keeping a digital or DG Connect or having or making sure that they're better collaborating. A better integrated approach will definitely benefit to the sector.
Thanks. Let me just say we're a little ahead of schedule, which is good, which is very good. Let me just say a word in conclusion in relationship to this issue of the structure. I think what we all seem to agree is that in order to deliver on growth and for the Commission to be able to play with its instruments a role in growth, one needs to have more consistency in the policy. So whether in the digital, whether you want to include the digital into a broader portfolio of the single market, which was the case obviously in the past. Obviously one made new portfolios as the number of members of the Commission increased, so one had to slice the single market portfolio. If you look at the old portfolio today, it corresponds to 3 or 4 commissioners. So this was, with 28 commissioners, you need to do this kind of thing. So I think we're all struggling with ways to address this fundamental problem. 28 commissioners, and for issues that do not need so many commissioners, and how to ensure coordination, how to ensure consistency. So I think, yes, one way would indeed be sort of to merge them back and number of them. The other one, which I think the one that we had put forward, but I'm not saying this is any better, but I think it pursues in the same direction, is this vice president for growth, who would not have any instrument, but would be really tasked by making sure that indeed what is being done on one hand with policy is consistent with what is done in the other, and the consistency is always, what does it mean in terms of growth? So I think it would be also a strong signal that, in a sense, 20 years ago you would have called it the Lisbon Commissioner. And we are still struggling for that because, nobody uses the Lisbon agenda term, but it's still that. There's nothing new. The 2020 agenda or the future agenda, it's still the old Lisbon agenda relabeled. And we are still, just as we have not finished with the single market, we are still not implementing the Lisbon agenda, but we are still there in a sense. So, and the Commission also has to organize itself in order to be able to deliver. So let me thank all the panelists. Let me just insist on the fact that the two fellows are available to talk to journalists. There is a press corner room, I think, someplace across there, and where the two fellows now are available to discuss with journalists in more depth what there is in their memos. So let me thank them. Let me also thank very much Antoine and Wolfgang for their very sharp point and addition to the discussion, and let me thank everyone. So let me invite the next panel then to come and take our place. Thank you very much.
welcome to our third panel, which is called the Macro Financial Agenda. I'm very pleased to have today with me Rebecca Christie from Bloomberg, who is an old-standing, well, I'm not saying friend, but a follower of Bruegel, of our work, and of course our two senior fellows, Jolt Darvash and Nicolas Véron, who will present their respective memos. Incidentally, Jolt will present a jointly drafted memo by himself and myself. The format is again the same as in the previous session, so we will have a short introduction, first by Jolt, 5 minutes, then by Nicolas, and then I would turn to you, Rebecca, to give horizontal as well as specific comments, and then we open it up. So without much further ado, Jolt, of course, Peter Spiegel already mentioned some of the things that are in our memo, but perhaps you can tell us what are the main challenges for the new DG ECFIN commissioner, the new commissioner who is responsible for the fiscal rules, but also for macro-financial issues. Let's see how the portfolio will look like, and how would you address those challenges?
Yeah, thank you, Guntram, very much. As it was already discussed in the opening session, I mean, the most important goal that Europe faces at the moment is to foster economic growth and job creation. But doing that in an environment when both the private and public sector are deleveraging, when inflation is low, and at the same time demand is quite weak throughout Europe, is extremely challenging. Another major challenge that the commissioner for ECFIN would face is the instruments that will be at the disposal of this commissioner. Because many of the issues and areas which can foster growth do not belong to his portfolio. In the previous section we have talked about the digital, the single market, research and so on. I mean, that's really crucial areas to foster economic growth, and why the ECFIN commissioner may have a chance to suggest structural reforms also along these lines in the so-called annual growth survey, which the Commission publishes every year. It will not have any direct control. Now, a third major challenge is also something that was already mentioned by Peter Spiegel, is the national political attitudes and developments. Because, I mean, a number of countries that is so-called fatigue for further fiscal consolidation, number of countries that are fatigue for structural reforms and so on, and there are also major diverse view among member states, and I mean, some member states want to push forward the way Europe traveled in the past few years, others want to change completely the course, and it's very difficult to broker a deal. And finally, also a major challenge we see ahead is managing financial assistance. For example, the average maturity of the loans to Greece is 32 years. 32 years, more than 3 decades. I mean, the last installment will need to be paid back in 2055. I cannot even calculate how long I will be if I will still alive at that time. So it will be a very challenging and long journey. Now, what do we recommend along with Guntram, because indeed the menu we have written together. I mean, the first one is very simple. We make 5 recommendations. The first one is related to structural reforms. I don't want to go into details because in the previous section we already discussed, but we indeed see that it is really, really crucial for the recovery to make better functioning labor markets, product markets, and public administration and so on. The second, related to fiscal rules, a discussion that already Peter Spiegel started. Now what we concluded that if we have this complicated fiscal structure, I mean the best strategy is to stick to it and not try to dilute it in one way or another, because again many member states are extremely in favor of such fiscal rules. If the new commissioner would start to somehow disregard the rules and use the vagueness of the rules to get over them, then probably we'll never be able to reach any consensus among member states, and we'll never be able to push through any good proposal. And by the way, I think, I mean, one can debate whether the fiscal rules are designed properly or not, but in the academic literature, there is very clear support that fiscal rules are important. I mean, countries having better fiscal rules, they used to be able to borrow at a cheaper rate. Now, the third recommendations we make, which was already mentioned also by André Sapir in his initial remarks, and I was also very happy to hear that Mario Draghi has also expressed it very clearly, is that, I mean, supply-side oriented structural reforms and fiscal consolidation is not enough in themselves to support growth, and indeed more demand is needed. And in our memo, we make some recommendations how to do that. Now, just very briefly, one is that we have now this so-called European semester and annual cycle for economic policy coordination in the EU. And I think there are a lot to improve there, a lot of room for improvement for many dimensions to make better recommendations, also for the euro area aggregate and translate it in a better way to what member states should do. The second point we make is a new investment program, and I would like to emphasize the new or additional. Mr. Juncker already announced a 300 billion euro investment program, but if you look at most of the components, they were already planned, and but we argue for something new. I mean, part which will be done at the national level. Now, Mr. Spiegel has said that very nicely, that those countries that can, they won't, and those countries that want, they can't. But indeed, those countries that can, I think they indeed should do, and the Commissioner has a very clear law to explain it very clearly that this is the best interest of these countries. But also, I think we should, I mean, Europe should provide much more funding to the European Investment Bank and place more emphasis on project bonds and the better use of the EU budget to foster growth. And now I'm running out of time. So I just mentioned that inflation is also a crucial issue. I mean, when there is a low inflation, it's very simple. I mean, budget revenues will be much lower. So budget deficits will increase, public debt ratios will increase. This is absolutely crucial to reach a 2% inflation, and not just in the Eurozone. I mean, in Sweden there is also low inflation, a number of Central European countries there is low inflation. And maybe I just mentioned the last 2 points and leave it like that, because I think that even though the markets are very optimistic now, in our view, markets are overly optimistic, and there are a number of reasons to worry. And in particular, if growth and inflation will remain low, there is a probability that the crisis will return, and the new commissioner will need to prepare for that. And finally, on the so-called Troika, the institutional framework of the Commission, the IMF and the European Central Bank, which manages financial assistance in the euro area, there are a number of areas where that institution need and should be reformed. So let me stop here and thank you for listening to me.
Excellent. Nicola, without much further ado, please.
Thank you, Guntram, and thanks also not only to you, but also to André Sapir for giving to all of us fellows the opportunity to participate in this project, which is lots of fun, because it's a great change also for us to take a 5-year perspective and go beyond, what's on the next big meeting, what's on the agenda of the next few weeks. I like the fact that on the cover it's EU to do in 2015 to 19, so 2014 is already off, and that's really the mindset of this project. So I very much pick up on Peter Spiegel's advice. You may not have time to read it now, but try.
Nicola, Peter's gone. I'm Rebecca Christie from Bloomberg, and I'm on the panel. You've said his name 6 times. I wrote about you. Thanks.
Nice reminder. We don't have. We don't have. Many things we don't have. But the advice was nevertheless good, and I'm sure you will repeat it as well, which was.
I might even have my own views. It's amazing.
You may not read it now, but read it in 2 years' time, because the fun thing about this is a medium to long-term perspective. Other thing to mention, of course, is that the memo I will comment on is co-written with Sylvia Merler, who is also here, fellow at Bruegel, and that's been part of the collective effort here. The financial sector is, of course, has been on the spotlight. It's not just that we had a financial crisis, it's also that arguably what has been initiated with banking union is really structural and goes beyond muddling through. So that makes our memo perhaps a bit more optimistic in tone than many of the other ones, because actually this is an area where Europe has proven a capacity to act and act in a way that makes a difference, is structural, has short-term effects, but also long-term structural changes. Now, obviously, our focus is on finance, not the rest of the single market, which has been commented upon, and with the assumption of no treaty change, which would lead to an entirely different discussion. It's an area that is complicated, lots of jargon, lots of special interests, lots of hidden agenda, devil in the details. The details matter a lot, but it's crucially related to the growth agenda, which is the overarching theme of the memos in general. And Reinhilde mentioned the connection between startup growth and the financial system. It's been emphasized in the long-term financing agenda that the Commission has tried to formalize. And I won't expand on all the challenges we identify. I'll go straight to the recommendations. So basically, we have 4 groups of recommendations. Maybe to simplify, 2 on the substance and 2 on the institutional and turf side. The substantial ones are beyond implementing all the leftovers. There's a lot of crisis management still. The banking union is still in an initial stage of implementation. But looking forward, the big push has to be, basically the sort of short summary is, there have been decisive decisions to deal with the banking situation. Now a lot of the attention has to shift to the rest of the financial system. So basically non-banking finance, capital markets, securitization being only one part of a much larger agenda. This has been hinted at by Jean-Claude Juncker in his big policy programming speech of mid-July. He has mentioned the need for a capital markets union. Now, capital markets union at this point remains to be defined, starting with the fact that this has to be, because it's capital markets, because the UK is central to European capital markets, it has to be a union that encompasses all the 28 member states, crucially the UK, and therefore very different from banking union in terms of its architecture, but also what that means beyond the moniker of capital markets union in terms of having actual reforms that will make a difference, not just tinkering at the edges, but some things that will really change the structure of the market and the way investors can provide financing to not just infrastructure, not just startup companies, but generally all the economic actors which need to borrow in Europe, remains very much to be defined. And I don't expect this debate to be settled quickly, but I think it's important to be ambitious. And being ambitious means also putting some politically contentious issues around the table. Some of them, yes, would involve centralization of authority. We make some modest proposals in the memo, which include a European single chief accountant that would enforce the implementation of accounting standards and IFRS across the union in a much more consistent manner than is currently the case, and that's crucial for investor protection and ultimately the efficiency of the market. And in the same vein, also more centralization of audit oversight, and then you can go into an even more ambitious agenda, for example, centralizing the supervision of crucial market infrastructure firms such as central counterparties. And then there is inevitably, because we're in Brussels, some recommendations about institutions and turf. And here we mention both internal and external challenges. Internally, it's really the fact that there is now a multiplicity of actors in this financial services space that didn't exist 5 years ago. So 5 years ago, the European Commission was virtually alone in that space at the European level. Now you have the 3 European supervisory authorities, you have the ESRB, you have the single supervisory mechanism within the ECB, and you have the single resolution board that is going to be live on 1st of January. So the Commission has to find its own position in this new, completely new landscape, and Europeans have spent a lot of time making fun at the US and the fragmented regulatory landscape there is there, but we're actually getting much closer to that. So a whole new set of coordination challenges. And then external challenges, it's not widely accepted in this town, but the EU is much less compliant with global financial reform initiatives than it was, or at least it looked 5 years ago. Europe had been a leader on Basel II. Europe, compared with other jurisdictions, including the US, is a laggard on Basel III. It's not entirely compliant. It's been very late in implementing G20 derivatives reform. It is less satisfied with IFRS than it was 5 years ago. So there is a need, both in terms of compliance and representation, to re-clarify what we think should be an EU position of leading and championing in the area of global financial standards, which we see very much in the EU's domestic interest, so to say, not just out of altruism. And I'll stop there for the discussion. Thank you.
Excellent. Rebecca, you've been
Thanks
not
very
enough
much.
mentioned, but certainly we look very much forward to your comments now.
Thank you. My name is Rebecca Christie. I work for Bloomberg News here in Brussels. I'm considering changing my Twitter handle to not Peter Spiegel, but perhaps I will be here as myself today. Listening to the comments that have come before and reading their excellent papers, which I recommend you read if you haven't already, there are a few things that come to mind. Back in 1999, when I was writing for the Financial Times, I covered Larry Summers, who was the Treasury Secretary, introducing the U.S. buyback program. That's right, the U.S. government went out and bought back a lot of its debt because it had too much debt and they were trying to get rid of it. Debt levels were then, as you recall, far lower than they are now. 2 years later, in 2001, I was at the Wall Street Journal. You will recall a significant event happened in New York, resulting in a lot of chaos for the markets as well as considerable loss of life and limb. One of the interesting things that followed on underneath a lot of the sorrow and the human toll from the September 11th terrorist attacks was that the bond market couldn't really find itself. Almost literally, half of the bond market, the computer records got blown up. And as a result, with the US buying back its debt, and they were still buying back debt at that time, if I recall correctly, there was not very much US Treasury debt in circulation. And when the Federal Reserve then lowered interest rates in an attempt to try and jumpstart the economy, it created a little mini crisis of financial stability where Treasury bond trades couldn't settle because there wasn't enough supply in the market. It's an interesting story to remember now in terms of thinking about the benefits of government bonds as a financial tool, as a financial instrument, and also about the plumbing aspects of financial stability. It's not just about numbers, it's not just about ratios, it's also about making sure there's enough fluidity, literally liquidity in the system to keep things flowing from one place to another. This afternoon, the ECB is going to say what sorts of instruments it wants to use to keep liquidity going and to keep monetary policy working. It will talk about using bonds, government bonds, and possibly asset-backed securities or other things as ways to keep the economy moving and work on its goal, among other things, to bring inflation back to 2%, which is the #1 thing that the European economy needs, according to the two esteemed gentlemen sitting next to me. Bonds are debt. Every time somebody says we can't have any more debt, they're saying we can't have any more bonds. They're saying we don't want a market. Now, levels are important with everything, but when I hear some of these policymakers saying we can't have any more debt, I also hear them saying we don't want a bond market and all of the things that go with that. Because if you don't have a big enough bond market, it doesn't move freely. If it doesn't move freely, it's far more expensive, and it also doesn't have a lot of these externalities. Along that point, in the memo, I have a handy PDF version. You can get it on their website if you don't want to carry the book around. You may notice there's a line here where talking about debt sustainability, particularly for countries like Greece that have a problem with their debt. Guntram and Jolt have written to the new commissioner, you might have to advocate debt reprofiling or even restructuring if debt is unsustainable. As this would have substantial implications for financial stability, just sort of parenthetical, doesn't even get its own sentence. It's just a, by the way, significant work to reduce the impact on the financial sector is needed. For example, by introducing single exposure rules. I'd love to hear more about how you guys think that would work. There was a time in the not too distant past when introducing collective action clauses into euro area debt was brought up. As I recall, it had immediate market effects, just the idea of it, long before it actually happened. Preparing the markets for that, preparing the markets to think of the euro area as a disunified area of default and not as a group of federal level nations. And I use federal in the sense of sovereign currency. California is not sovereign. California can default, it's bad, but you know what? It doesn't have its own flag. If you have a flag, you're sovereign. If you're sovereign, people need to believe in you. And even if we don't have, I think, especially since there isn't a United States of Europe, it's all the more important for these individual sovereign states to maintain that sovereign level, country level credibility in the bond market to keep it going. So I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts on that.
You have something for Nicolas?
Yes, I did read Nicolas' paper. It is, of course, brilliant and flawless. If you read my copy, you'll see he shows up in it a lot, so I'm a fervent follower of what he has to say. The bits that we were most interested in, I read it with one of my colleagues, where you talked about the EU's role in global rules. You talk about the EU now being a laggard, I think was the word you used, in Basel III and some of the other international standards. So after we've discussed, the entire world global bond market, maybe you could tell us how the global capital rules are going to work and where Europe will come in that, if they will come back to the front, if they will end up behind. They're related questions.
Okay, let me perhaps open the floor before we give the floor back to the panelists, because I'm sure there will be additional questions on both on the single capital market. Nicolas, very important point to shift attention perhaps a bit more from the banking to the non-bank based financial intermediation.
Those are bonds, debt.
Exactly, the bad things. And also, of course, the DG ECFIN commissioner has a lot on his plate, and I guess one of the points we've been making is exactly that. We want to avoid ending up in this scenario, and therefore better get the policies right. But of course, if you don't get them right, you may have to think about those nasty kind of things, and I think that's we cannot exclude that. Anyway, let me give the floor to the audience. Who would like to ask a question? Please raise your hands. There are microphones around. Nobody? Please, yes.
James Watson, Business Europe. Just a point of clarification, really. Zolt talked about investment and public investment. There's a statement in the forward, actually, on page 11 that talks about public investment should be increased by 100 billion in 2015-2016. I'm presuming that's overall investment. I mean, public investment, I think in the EU is about just under 300 billion. And the latter paragraph talks about sort of using public investment to leverage private investment. So just for clarification for the record, you're not actually talking about increasing public investment by 100 billion, but overall investment.
I just wanted to solicit a comment. Particularly, as you said, a non-federalized Europe needs a kind of a federal bond market. To the best of my knowledge, we see a defederalization or a decommunitarization of the bond markets in the sense that more and more of Italian debt is in Italian hands, more and more of French debt is in French hands, and so we see a decline of the common bond market in the sense of being transnational within Europe, and the extreme would be Japan, of course, where 97% of the Japanese debt is in the hand of Japanese investors. Should we worry about that? Or does it make default of a single nation more likely because the externalities are becoming smaller? Maybe just a question here to throw on the three of you.
Yes, please.
Thank you. David Weber. Mine's sort of maybe more of a historic review question, particularly for Nicolas, because in 2009, you presented the last memos on economic priorities. The Commission worked on those with Bruegel, and I really wonder to what extent we're just repeating the same old story, and are we actually, by repeating that story, making a ginormous critique on the last Commission and on the last governance, and we're basically saying, to a large extent, next time, just do something.
Okay, I can take one more question, and yes, please. You did.
Yes, thank you. It's a question for Nicolas. My name is Judith Hart from the Swiss Finance Council. You were talking about the Capital Market Union. Unfortunately, I have not had the opportunity to read the briefs. What is your vision for equity markets? Because clearly we do have relatively developed bond markets, but our equity markets remain relatively small, and clearly they need to play a role in financing growth. And when you see what Europe, I'm sorry, bring it up and up. What Europe has done in terms of the last 10 years is create scale, which helps big markets like London. But in fact, all the small ecosystems have dried up, so you don't really have a lot of capacity to finance SMEs in Eastern Europe or even in some of the Mediterranean countries. What is the vision in terms of, the capital markets for equities?
So I give each of you 2 minutes for your answer so that we can end at 12, and perhaps we start in reverse order. Rebecca, would you like to add or comment on any of the remarks?
Well, to comment on the question about bond market fragmentation, historically, Italy, which has historically had very high levels of outstanding debt, has had a very good reputation for selling its debt, for doing the road shows, for going on the road and telling investors, you can count on us. If you buy our debt, you can roll it over. You'll get a consistent yield. It's a sturdy thing. Germany, just to pick another country, does not have that reputation. And in fact, about once a year, a German bond auction fails, which continues to blow my mind. In Germany, when this happens, the Bundesbank goes out and buys up the rest of the bonds and says, you know what, everyone will want them, we'll just send them out a little bit later and all will be well. And magically it is, because people believe in Germany. It shows you the miracle of credibility that is the entire concept of a sovereign bond. Some countries, like the US and Italy, keep their credibility by making sure that no matter what, when they sell debt, they can roll it over. There's no concern there about, will the US have a bond market tomorrow? Other countries like Germany just say, well, you should believe in us because, and people do. And then some countries like Spain end up in the Italy category for a long time, and then one morning they wake up and their yields are at 8 or 9% and they don't know what to do and they have to ask for a bailout. Thinking structurally about the role that markets play in these different examples. And I'm not talking about fundamentals now in terms of ratios of debt to GDP or things like that, but thinking structurally about what a market does for you, I think is a very useful thing. It's not a traditional European approach to considering stability, but it's something I would introduce into the discussion.
So basically, 3 questions in 2 minutes. Rebecca's question on EU and global. I think there's been a lot of denial in this town and in the EU more generally that something actually very natural has happened. The crisis has led to more inward focus, more re-regulation, and that's more difficult to square with a global financial consistency agenda than the previous phase, which was mostly about deregulation. It's easier to harmonize globally when you deregulate than when you re-regulate. It's as simple as that. And there's been another factor, which is that there are new economic powers out there, large emerging markets and the like. And the EU hasn't really accepted that. I mean, in the area of financial services, the EU still tries to cling to an obsolete vision where, you know, it's only the EU and the US and the rest should only follow, which I think is increasingly counterproductive. And just for the sake of provocation, I think we have to think very seriously about our stance in TTIP in this respect. Do we really want to say, well, it's now or never, we set the rules with our American friends for the rest of the world, which has been... Yeah, exactly. So I won't expand on this, but if you look at Basel III, we'll see with interest the reports from the Basel Committee later this year, but the ones 2 years ago were not favorable in terms of EU compliance. If you think of IS 39, how the EU forced the ISB to change the standard to put it on a lower level, frankly, of standards quality in 2008. If you think of derivatives, where we're very late in implementation and the implementation is fairly chaotic. Full disclosure, I'm involved with one of the trade repositories, but this is really an independent judgment. So basically the EU is no longer in the position of leadership where it was pre-crisis. And many people in this town have, I think, been very slow, to say the least, to recognize this shift. Now there are good news, and the good news come primarily from banking union. Banking union makes the EU a much heftier player in a number of those global discussions than it was before. And actually, if you think of banking supervision, for example, the ECB will be on an equal footing with the Fed when the dust settles, which is completely new. So it may not be good news for the individual national authorities that will lose their relevance in the Basel Committee and the FSB and other fora, but for the EU as a whole, I think it's very positive looking forward. But I think we have to look at this more in depth and understand better, look also at how others, especially Asians, are looking at Europe in this respect and really try to adapt. The question about the memo being just a repetition of what we wrote in 2009, actually I don't think that's the case. I mean, of course there are common threads, especially when there is a continuity of authorship, and that is the case for André and a few others, and I'm one of them, together with Sylvia in this round. The memo in 2009 told Commissioner Barnier, you need an overarching vision, you need consistency in what you're going to do. I think it's slightly uncharitable to say that, but not entirely untrue to say that sometimes this overarching vision has been lacking in the past 5 years, maybe compensated for Barnier's considerable capacity to get things through, and he has, pushed a lot of legislation, so you could see it as a good or bad thing, but it has happened. He has made it happen. So this powerhouse effect within the Commission, I think, has been positive. Now, the big news thing again is banking union, and entirely out of the crisis. And I know that many people at the Commission like to think that the Commission has made it happen. I don't think that's the case. I think banking union has been pushed primarily by other actors, but I think it has changed the landscape in a way that actually addresses a lot of the concerns that we expressed in the memo 5 years ago. So I wouldn't say it's always the same thing. Finally, on equity markets, very quickly, it's about transparency, and I mentioned consistent IFRS implementation and consistent auditing. I think that's crucial. It's about infrastructure. I think we have to think about the same way you spoke about bond market infrastructure. I think we have to think about equity market infrastructure and how we can make it more consistent and less costly in terms of cross-border transactions, especially. It's about prudential rules and tax rules, and we don't go into much detail in the memo, but clearly here there are things that go beyond, especially in tax, the mandate of the Commissioner for Financial Services. But I agree with you. If we want to promote equity markets in Europe, we have to look at it in a holistic way, and that has to include things that are beyond just financial market legislation. Thank you.
Jolt, in minus 1 minute, you have the last but not the least group, please.
Yes, thank you, Guntram. I also answered 3 questions. So on James' clarification that we call for this 1% of EU GDP new public investment, and it can generate, especially through the EIB, additional private investment. On Reiner's question, whether the increase in home bias, whereby banks hold even more bonds of their national governments, whether it's a worry, I do think it's a worry, because first of all, it signals that before the crisis, as Silvia Merler, who is here and wrote a lot about that, there was an increase in foreign ownership, foreign bank ownership too of banks, and it has changed. So it does signal that there's lack of confidence from other countries, and that's bad. And also, I mean, there could be different opinions whether the banking union will be able to sever the link between banks and sovereigns. But if banks hold a huge amount of the national debt, that's a major threat to their own stability and their capacity to lend to the economy. And finally, on Rebecca, I mean, I think I very much agree with you. And the ideal setup indeed would be a US-style setup, and there is a federal bond market called Eurobond or another way. And then, you know, if you know, Greece or another country would default, that could be a local problem without major implications for the financial system. But this is not the case. And I think the situation before the crisis, where all sovereign debt were treated the same way, and by the way, market did not discriminate, and the spread of Greece to Germany in the 10-year maturity was 40, 50 basis points or almost nothing. I think that was a wrong situation. And I mean, sovereigns have different, vulnerability. All sovereigns are also risky. I mean, even if you look at the CDS of the United States or Germany, there is also some small probability of default. So I do think that in the discriminating or regulatory discrimination between sovereigns, and in particular, whenever a country asks for a rescue and the debt is seen not sustainable, then I mean it should be done upfront. And in Greece, it was a major mistake to delay the debt restructuring.
Okay, excellent. Now, thank you to all the panelists, and let me invite the panelists for the next panel on the floor.
Okay, so welcome for this last session, which deals with global challenges. And as André already said this morning, there are clearly global challenges for Europe. He raised the point that while Europe is muddling through, the world is changing fast. And of course, there is a high risk that if we are too inward looking, that we will be missing important sources of growth, markets outside Europe, but also missing important resources for growth to attract them. And there is a risk of exodus of our growth agents to these other more dynamic places here. So clearly global challenges are very important for Europe, and that's what we will be focusing on in the memos in this session here. So we start with trade policy, neighborhood policy. Mostly the discussion will be on trade policy, which will be taken by André. Then we move to migration policy, which Rainer Hunz will deal with. And then we close with climate policy and energy policy, where also, again, the global challenges are really very pivotal for dealing with the issues here, and that will be dealt with by Georg Zachman. So we're very short on time, so I'll be very strict as a chair. Floor is yours, André, for 7 minutes. So could you identify what you think are the major recommendations, given all these challenges that Europe is facing, you have for the Trade Policy Commissioner?
Thanks, thanks, Renil. So I want to address three issues. I think which are the three main recommendations that we make to the Trade Commissioner. The first one may sound a bit surprising, but we start from the viewpoint that has been discussed many times this morning, that one of the defining elements of the times we are living through is globalization, and also the role of the emerging countries in this globalization. And in a sense, we find it somewhat contradictory that at the same time that we are in this phase of very rapid and deep increase of globalization, global rules and global rule making in the field of trade, that is the WTO, the World Trade Organization, is probably not receiving the attention and the care that it should. You know, every other day, after as there was recently a number of discussion around what's happening in Geneva at the WTO, there is the feel that the WTO is losing steam. And the Doha round that started in 2001 maybe will never be concluded. You know, people are asking whether WTO is dying or soon going to be dead. And at the same time, with this globalization and the need for global rules, and we feel very much that global rules and global rules that exist already and global rule making should be the priority of the Trade Commissioner. In a sense, the Trade Commissioner is the globalization commissioner in that sense. And we feel that the commissioner, whether it's a he or she, should put the main emphasis on the multilateral trading system. Now, in a sense, I say it's a bit going against the grain, because everybody feels that, you know, all the action is elsewhere on the bilateral deals. And in a sense, our recommendation is, you know, go against the grain. And be within the Commission, be the commissioner that for global issues always put forward the need of global rules. Even though many people would sort of push you into doing all those bilateral deals, don't forget the need of overarching rules, which are the global rules, which is therefore the WTO. So don't let the system die. And on the contrary, use your strength, and your strength is the fact that Europe still is the largest trading partner in the world. For goods, yes. For services, certainly. We are the largest global trading partner. If you look at imports and exports together, we are still the largest, and we have a responsibility in that. Certainly of the trade agenda in Brussels, together with some other trade deals, bilateral trade deals, the discussion with Japan, the discussion with Canada, and with a number of other countries. But TTIP is with this. We'll have to continue the discussion. We, the two of us who are the authors of the memo, and that's what we tell the commissioner, said, be realistic. The hype that came at the launch of the negotiation was just hype. That's just what it was. The view that this negotiation was going to be concluded, as it was said at the beginning, in 2014, maybe now in 2015, this is just nonsense. This is just nonsense. You cannot do this kind of negotiation with the ambition there is and think that you will conclude this in 2015. So the negotiation will continue, but be realistic. If you can find a result, it will be in 2017. But mostly, don't forget that now the EU and the US, and that was the point of Nicolas before, are becoming a smaller part of this global pie. And make sure that if we have an agreement, TTIP, EU-US, this is not the West against the rest. And that needs a lot of work. So we are not saying the Commission drop this, but make sure that this agreement goes in a sense, goes not against the emerging countries. And maybe let me stop here, because maybe I've exhausted my time, and that's all right.
Yes, we know you're very passionate about this topic, so I'm sure you'll be able to pick up during the discussion. The other issue that touches upon this global dimension is the migration issue. And Rainer, can you present what you think are the major recommendations you have for a new commissioner for migration?
Yeah, I'm talking a commissioner which has not yet existed in the past, who she or she would be responsible both for external migration and internal mobility. So I start with the mobility. The fact that we have a couple of regions in Europe, notably in Italy, Spain and Greece, where unemployment is 20%, and a few others in Germany, Sweden, Austria, where it's between 3 and 4%. But even Bratislava, the capital of Slovakia, is below 5% unemployment, shows that there's not a single European labor market where people would move around, but a fragmented one, because there's not enough mobility between these 28 markets. So there clearly is not only a lack of a market for services or digital economy, but there's also not a single European labor market. Let's face it, and this is something that needs to be addressed. Now, how could you address this? Make it easier to move around. And we have a few proposals in the memo. We need a speedier recognition of skills. Language issues need to be addressed. There is still not the full portability of acquired rights and benefits when it comes to employer benefits. There is still hidden barriers and glass ceilings when you want to enter so far protected professions and trades. Yes, if Norman Foster or Santiago Calatrava is invited to build a museum or a bridge in Berlin, that works, but just try to move as an architect from the UK or Spain to Germany and start a business there. It's almost impossible. Try to become a teacher in Austria and Sweden, very difficult. Try to be a notary, impossible. Things like that. So there's something that needs to be done here. Number two, and that's almost unrelated to what I have said, but is much closer to this globalization issue, is, and a footnote here. If we would have more mobility of workers, they could serve as a shock absorber in the case of macroeconomic instabilities, something that we see in the US but not in Europe. In the US, 2.7% of workers are moving between states annually. In Europe, it's between 0.1 and 0.2% of all workers moving between the 28 member states. Next issue is dealing with irregular flows of migrants. That's unrelated. It has to do with the fact that on the one side we have unfolding humanitarian, economic, but also ecological crises and disasters in our near neighborhood. And we have 42,000 kilometers of sea borders and 7,000 kilometers of land borders with non-Schengen, non-EU countries. So people are able to cross them increasingly. It will be 120,000 people crossing the Mediterranean this year on an irregular basis. And what we see in Europe is, on the one side, the irregular inflows, almost all going into Spain, Italy, Greece, Malta, and Bulgaria. But 70 to 80% of all asylum claims are not happening there. They happen in Germany, Austria, Sweden, the UK, the Netherlands. So it's a completely different set of countries. So what we see here is a lack of a coherent policy, in the sense that we need more burden sharing. It can't be that the burden is up on Italy and Greece, but these countries have an incentive of letting these people go so they claim asylum in Germany or in Sweden. Yeah? So something needs to be done here. On the other hand, let's not forget, we have a common obligation to offer help and protection for people in need, but the predicament being there are many more people in need for assistance, for protection, than the European Union will ever be able to accept and willing and able to be accepted, yeah, period here. Third point, immigration from third countries unrelated to refugee flows and people in need of protection. And I think here the clear issue to see, we have to reinvigorate the idea that an aging and graying Europe in the medium and long term can not only rely on a better allocation of its people through higher mobility within EU 28, but will also be in need of attracting labor and skills, in particular skills from third countries. Immigration, a growth agenda, also a high-tech and skills agenda on that side, go hand in hand, and this has been forgotten during this crisis to a large extent. We have been further in the development of our migration policies 5 to 10 years ago, and because of the crisis, we have become a lot more inward-looking on that issue. Let's not forget that an aging, graying, and demographically declining Europe cannot have no immigration policy that attracts skilled people from other parts of the world. And then in that sense, we have to become a lot more attractive. So it's not just the startup business angel money going 3 billion to Europe and 30 billion to the US. When you look at the PhDs going, it's almost following the same pattern. Thanks.
Perfect in terms of timing. So in the issues of energy and climate change, of course, Europe is also an important player on a global scene and has to take into account all these global challenges here. Georg, can you explain what solutions you have for the European Commissioner for Energy and as well as climate change to deal with these global challenges?
Thank you, Reinhilde. I'll start with the climate issue, and this has not become easier in the past years. So in terms of fossil fuels, only oil and gas, what has been explored in addition to what was known before, is worth about $86 trillion. And it is able to heat up or increase the concentration of climate gases in the atmosphere by 50 parts per million, which would essentially already, only the new found, bring us beyond the 2-degree target. That's not to say all the oil and gas we already have found, and it's not to say the coal that is under the soil and is going to be produced. So it's not looking good on that. And Europe can definitely not do this alone, because Europe currently represents about 11% of the global greenhouse gas emissions, and we have not seen an international agreement 2009 in Copenhagen, and for 2015 in Paris, the prospects are not looking extremely good, also because it's very difficult to not burn this very valuable bounty of fossil fuels that some countries possess. So what is our thinking, or my thinking on that is, what Europe should do is essentially not trying to do a decarbonization at home at massive scale, trying to go from 11% of global emissions to 0% of global emissions, because that will not win the game. But Europe's role is to enable global decarbonization. So there, I see, is the biggest contribution that Europe can do there. And I come here in with 3 ins, which is international agreements, instruments, and innovation. So on international agreements, it's obvious. Without the agreement of the other partners, it will be impossible to set up even European instruments. And Europe can help getting those sorts of international agreements by helping other countries and other parts of the world to make decarbonization cheaper. And Europe can do this by developing the instruments, and we have a very nice instrument with the emission trading system that worked not perfectly in the past, but could be strengthened. And we have already in the past pushed innovation a lot. Europe was one in the forefront of many innovations in the renewable energy fields and others, and there Europe could also do much more. So in order to enable the globe to decarbonize really, we should go much stronger on the instrument side And we make a proposal in the memo, and we made it before, about essentially extending the ETS to other sectors, the emission trading system, but also giving it more credibility by having some financial anchor of the ETS. And on innovation, which I will also like to talk about in the framework of the energy memo, I think if we don't manage to get technologies that can compete on equal footing with the fossil fuels, and you have to keep in mind that fossil fuels will become cheaper and cheaper, the less because you can produce oil in Saudi Arabia at $5 per barrel, that it will not be possible to keep those bounty underground. So let me quickly come to the energy memo. Here, I see two overarching challenges. So I had to smile when Nicolas Véran spoke about how nice it is to have memos until 2019, and that's for a kind of macroeconomic and financial sector quite a long-term perspective. In energy, we are speaking about lead times for new power plants that will rest until 2070. The climate targets are essentially defined for 2050, and we are now talking about energy and climate targets in the European Union for 2030. So what Europe essentially needs is a credible investment framework. Nobody currently knows, in the very volatile politics in the energy sector and in the climate area, where to invest on. And that's why governments are stepping in and deciding we want this amount of renewables, UK decide we want this amount of nuclear power plants, Poles decide we want this, and then we have both a renationalization and kind of a government pick of the fuel mix that is certainly not going to deliver a well-balanced, cheap and secure European fuel mix. And the second challenge is obviously renationalization. The past 5 years in the energy sector were essentially the unbundling of the internal market. We had renewable subsidies nationally decided, we had capacity mechanisms popping up, we had the undermining of the European emission trading system. So this trend of renationalization has to be reversed with force, and that will be the two overarching challenges for the new Commission. So long-term investment framework and reversing renationalization. In terms of recommendations, I'll pick out two of them. There are some more in the book. One is refocus renewables on innovation. So currently, renewables as climate change is very much about quick reduction in terms of CO2 emissions. We want to deploy the technologies that are currently available. We are spending hundreds of billions of euros in Europe for deploying renewables. And the effect of this is essentially that the CO2 price drops and more coal plants are running. So that's not where we should end up with. I think renewables are crucial for making global decarbonization possible. For this, we should balance much more between R&D subsidies or R&D support to develop the renewables that can really make a difference in the future, and also some instruments for deployment, because deployment is needed. Deployment is the carrot for industrial companies to invest in innovation. But we need it much more balanced. Currently, more than 99% of the money for renewables goes into deployment, and very often technologies that are not very mature, compared to less than 1% that goes into R&D support. And the second thing I would like to give short attention to, because it's so timely, it's security of supply. And here, there's a conundrum. On the one hand, the functioning of the internal market seems to be very good for rationing, but the internal market does not work. But the internal market will also not solve the security of supply issue on a European scale, because private companies that are buying energy outside Europe and bringing it to Europe are hurting to go for the cheapest option, and then they are ending up all buying from pivotal places like Russia. On the other hand, if you go then for public intervention, you have public crowd out. You're building a pipeline from Turkmenistan with European public money, and then there is no pipeline being built from Cyprus. So that also doesn't work. So what we are suggesting is essentially to create a market framework again, a market framework in which you get money for supplying security of supply. More explanation is in the book, and I'm happy to take questions on that.
Thanks a lot for also sticking to the time. So I'm very happy that we have as a discussant Sumant Berry, Chief Economist at Shell. I think you're one of the few that can really cover all of these different areas, being at a truly global company that's dealing in energy issues here. So floor is yours for some comments on all of the memos.
Thanks. Well, there's one there. Thanks, Reinhilde. And please give me about a time check in about 5 or 6 minutes, because I do want to leave time for discussion. Because it is such a wide canvas and because there have been interesting points that have been made, let me just start by saying that I'm here certainly with the Shell hat on, but I'm a development economist. I came to Shell from heading a think tank in India, which is where I first encountered Bruegel. I'm pleased that Shell is a corporate supporter of Bruegel, because Shell is one of the largest, if not the largest, companies by market capitalization in the EU. I think if you include Switzerland, Nestle might be larger. And I think I want to, as it were, use the privilege of being a non-European in this discussion to just make a couple of general points before I come to energy and climate change. I do think that Europe's recovery is very important for the global recovery. I do think it is striking that the slowdown in the global recovery seems to have taken place in 2010, essentially when the euro crisis erupted. I think what's very important and impressive are the numbers in this volume about how important a global player Europe is. And I do think that as an internal discussion takes place, as it must, about how to get growth going again, Europe has to recover its mojo as a global player. And I think that an important contribution that Bruegel does make is to remind us that Europe's importance to global leadership is just as important as as the importance of America, and that it has a distinctive role to play. I think the second point I'd like to pick up, I won't mention Peter Spiegel because that is now barred, but I think the question of why the future might be different from the past is an important one. It's an important one, indeed, even in the energy area that I'll come to in a minute. And I think that Andre did make the point earlier on, is because the world is moving on. I do think, though, this book is now completed, I do think it is really incumbent upon think tanks like Bruegel to keep reminding policymakers in this town of the amount of money that's being left on the table, as it were, through inefficient national solutions, rather than, as it were, the integration of the single market. That brings me to a third generic point, which is the political economy point. So why is so much money left on the table? We know from basic welfare economics that it is possible to, as it were, get the gains from reform and then redistribute. So is it the absence of those redistribution mechanisms that is the reason why Europe finds it so difficult to move from where it is to where it ought to be? I'm a part of the scenarios team in Shell, and we have coined the phrase trapped transition to talk about situations where clearly the comparative statics indicates that you would be in a better position, but the dynamic path is politically and economically difficult. And I do think that Bruegel has a special role to play in always bringing that issue to the table. So I've used up a lot of my time, but I do think that those generic issues about A, the crucial importance of Europe for the world, and B, the crucial importance of both more Europe and less Europe in how we go forward, should not be lost sight of. If I could just bring those points now to the important discussion on on energy and climate change. Let me just say that I think in the way that André said that we must not lose sight of the importance of the WTO, and I, in this context, would remind people that both India and China, who are sometimes painted as bogeys for the Western world, they are the people who have the most at stake, actually. They have flourished and hope to flourish within multilateral disciplines, and I really applaud the notion that not painting TTIP and et cetera as the West against the rest. I think that's absolutely vital, and I'm glad to find that here. But to come to energy. So I think that growth is one of the things that's going to help the ETS return to life. I think it's a very important reason for the weak, and Shell certainly believes that the ETS has a very important role to play, and an important role to play in sending out the signals of a stable, robust carbon price. I mean, we do think that that is going to be the most efficient way in which to bring about decarbonization. Certainly, I think, and maybe there's a difference between, sort of Georg and the point of view that of Shell. The question of what contribution renewables can play in global decarbonization, I think, is an important debate to have. I mean, we have some numbers in our scenarios. I think we certainly believe that if fossil fuels are going to play an important role, as we believe they are, it is going to be fossils, CCS, gas replacing coal, that constitutes a more feasible pathway to the future. And the one thing that I found, or the 2 points on which I found Jorg's 2 essays comparatively silent, were one, what would be the machinery to bring others along, as it were? What are feasible solutions to the problem of carbon leakage? And secondly, at the end of the day, how worried should we be about the limits to renewables in the energy system in terms of stability, in terms of robustness? And another point, which is not relevant to Europe, but whether those solutions are generalizable for economies like that of India, which are starting out and don't have a fossil backbone, because I think that you can count on the existence of that in the case of Europe, which newcomers perhaps can't. So let me leave it at that. I think I've exceeded my time.
Yep, thank you. It's perfect. So we still have a bit of time for also questions. It's a good opportunity in this last session for raising some questions. Do we have any? Okay, you can also raise a question, yeah.
No, I just want to flag something. Jim O'Neill, who is associate fellow at Bruegel, and who was, as everyone knows, was at Goldman Sachs, coined the phrase the BRICS. Wrote a memo that we did not discuss. That's what I want to flag. That he couldn't be here with us, unfortunately. And when we were discussing the memos, I asked him actually to write the memo on the neighborhood, because I thought, here's somebody who's been associated with sort of this global vision and the BRICS and this great transformation which is associated to the BRICS. I thought it would be very interesting to have his views about the neighborhood. So I'm not going to say anything about this. I just want to flag it, and I just want to say it's a very interesting perspective that he brings to the table, and I commend this memo to you.
Okay, so you made us sufficiently curious to have a look at the memo. Thanks. Yep.
Hi there, I'm Will Dorling from Pfizer. I just had a question about the trade issue. So, I think everybody who believes in free trade would like to see the WTO succeed. But at the same time, I guess we have to acknowledge that, you know, we haven't had significant progress for quite a long time. So, you know, at what point do we need to sort of stop the best being the enemy of the good and think about, you know, if we assume that maybe the WTO won't actually make progress, what's the best way for Europe to, you know, maximize the opportunity for our economy in the next 5-10 years?
You have some more questions? Okay. So perhaps we can go back to the panel for one last round of comments. First of all, let me thank the discussant. It's always nice to have a non-European reminding us of how important Europe is also to the world. Thanks for that. But I would also like to, certainly when you address your comments, to address this issue of the implications for the governance of these global issues, both inside the EU, but also what changes you would recommend in terms of changes in the global governance of global institutes that is needed for dealing with the challenges that you were facing. André, you'd like to start, or you're still thinking?
No, I can say something. I mean, I don't have the time to go deep into the question, which is a typical question which is asked. I mean, I've heard this question 50 times, and which means it's an important question. I don't mean it's you know, to trivialize it, just the other way around. It's a question that one needs to address, and I think you're right. I think, to my mind, and that's the only response I will give to this serious question, is I think the EU and the US, I mean, since they're driving TTIP, I think they need to make clear to themselves and to others what is the objective. I think that is not fully clear. So I think there are two possible ideas here. One is it's a bilateral deal, and that through this improving or bilateral relationship, we are going to have more trade between each other. Maybe one day create a sort of a transatlantic market, like we are trying to do inside the EU, sort of a single market, transatlantic single market, and that can have all kinds of beneficial effect. Fine, I think that's fair enough, but then we have to remember, obviously, that the trade between the EU and the US, in proportion of our total trade, both for the EU and the US, is becoming a smaller and smaller share, okay? And that's one possibility. The other possibility is that it's not that so much, it's about rule making. It is about global rule making, so our objective is not bilateral, our objective is about global rulemaking, but we are trying to make the global rules between the two of us. And I think that will not work. We can say, you know, why India and China and others, Brazil, are not cooperating, and they're difficult partners. They may be very difficult partners, I don't deny that, but they're necessary partners. So I think that this time will not work, the fact, in my view, that we are going to make bilateral rules that will turn to be global rules, that we will put on the table. This is the result of our rule making now, and this is the rules for the world. This just will not work. So either we want global rules, and if we want global rules, we have to work hard at it, but have a global approach.
Same's true for migration. The core concept of European or US or Australian or Canadian migration policy, it's unilateral. Europe or the US is setting rules, and then they are letting people in. There is hardly any negotiation ever, or even a forum where the sending and the receiving countries, when it comes to migration, would be sitting together and discussing these rules. The US would never want to have a multilateralization of its migration policy, and the European Union is a bit further because there's some mobility partnerships, but basically we are not offering a lot to the countries. And in particular, we are talking to countries whom we want to bribe into keeping people at bay, not sending countries. So we have been talking to Libya, which no longer exists. We have been talking to Turkey, to Morocco, and trying to say, keep your people at home and make sure that third country nationals are not crossing the borders. Now, what interest has a country like Morocco or Egypt or Turkey of keeping people from Afghanistan or Somalia or Mali inside its borders instead of letting them go to Europe? There's almost no material incentive as long as we are not offering labor visas or visa waivers for Turkish or Moroccan nationals, things like that. So there would be something, there would be some bargaining chips, but we are not using them, or we're not using them wisely, or we're dissociating a visa waiver for Turkey from the migration control issue of third country national, things like that. So I think one could become smarter even when it comes to control. Let's not forget, there is 700 million entries into the Schengen area every year, and only 0.5% or less are related to migration. All the rest is business, family, travel, tourism, things like that, that has nothing to do with migration. So I think we cannot solve this issue by just closing this Fortress Europe vision or something like that. Will never work because of this, there's so much entry and exit on that sense. So I think there is solutions. We could become smarter. We have not become smarter yet on that.
Okay, hopefully we're learning though. Georg?
Maybe on 2 points. I was very intrigued by the redistribution issue that Suman brought up. In the energy field, it's especially in the electricity sector, it's an enormous task. The inefficiencies of national regulations and not creating a single market are getting bigger and bigger. The more renewables you have, the better it is to have a larger system. And it is recalculated getting in the order of 10% of the total cost of electricity production. So it would make much sense to do it, and we hope that also with the initiatives for energy union, that there will be some momentum for really going for the big horse trading, because the devil is very deep into the details. People are discussing about whether the hour at which you have to notify your transmission system operator that you bring in some electricity is half an hour before or 1 hour before, and you have a locked-in system. And that's even more difficult than what Mario described for the digital market. Here we not only have a market that has all those complexities and externalities, but it's also a market with huge locked invested interests, because it has billions of euros already invested in regulatory systems that developed out of the national systems that were in place. And in addition, it's a market that does not really grow, and therefore there's no hope that you simply grow out of the problems. And so a big horse trading in for the energy union to create a real single energy market would be needed, and we have some suggestions on how to organize such a process, but this will be one of the biggest challenges. And if I may, just one point on the limits of renewables. We have not discussed individual technologies a part of renewables, which we highlighted because they have been so high on the European agenda and because there is 2030 targets discussed. Overall, also in the climate memo we mentioned, we are strongly in favor of a technology neutral mechanism to select essentially which technologies get support. That process needs to be really get credibility, get more open and transparent. There is some things around like the strategic energy technology plan, but there's no money behind, and bringing this together could really help, and it's a lot of money that would need to be spent.
I know where I'm standing between you and lunch, so just 2 or 3 quick points. The first is, I think it's very wise and, in a sense, thoughtful of Andre to make this point that the stitch-up won't work. And let me tell you that, when I have similar discussions at think tanks in Washington, that's not the point of view. The point of view is that, the Indians and Chinese are tough to work with, so let's have the stitch-up and get on with it. That's point number one. The second point, really, from what Rainer has said, Jagdish Bhagwati has been arguing for a long time that the world needs a world migration organization. It's not happened, but I do think that the absence of fora to discuss these things is a lacuna in global governance. The third point would again be there is in the trade memo, in effect, a so-called assignment principle, that you use the TTIP to take the barnacles of your regulation, and you use the WTO and the Doha Round multilateral to really provide non-discriminatory access to the emerging markets, which is a much more efficient way and a fairer way of really capturing the importance of trade to the South. So I think that those are certain principles that could be used to in a sense, overcome some of the resistance and the fear-mongering really associated with the WTO. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. So let me take the opportunity to thank all the panel members. I think we had a very good discussion, and we gave a very clear signal that Europe should avoid all this internal muddling through and should really use global challenges as a way to really invigorate growth here. Let me also take the opportunity, because this is the last session, last panel here, to thank particularly all the contributors to the memo, but particularly also André Sapir and Guntram Wolff for coordinating this big important piece here. We hope that this will continue to stimulate the discussion in Brussels, not just only now here, but actually up till 2019 here and beyond, and hopefully we cannot repeat the same type of exercise next time here, and we can come up with other memos in 2019. But the floor is now for lunch and for continuing discussion. Thanks.
Thank you.